So today's workshop is part of Understanding How You Learn workshop series, and our topic is the brain and learning. This workshop is developed and brought to you by the Academic Success Center, which is part of Library and Academic Services at the college. My name is Meg Lowen. I work at the Academic Success Center as an academic support specialist. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that RRC Polytech campuses are located on the lands of Anishinaabe, Inninewak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. So this is our agenda for today. This session will be quite short. It's scheduled to be in half an hour. If there is something that comes to mind, a question or a comment, you can put it in the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat. This workshop is divided into 4 sections, 4 different things that the brain needs to learn. And they are sleep, time, breaks, and practice. So there will be times in this workshop where I ask you to reflect a little bit on your own studying and learning practice so far as a student, and I encourage you to do that so that you can get more out of this workshop. So let's start with a question. Let's say you're running in a marathon tomorrow. How do you spend the night before the big race? Maybe some of you have even run in marathons before. Do you stay up all night jogging, or do you go to bed and get a good night's sleep? Now, I'm sure all of you are thinking that if you had to run a marathon in the morning, it would be important to get a good night's sleep. This is fairly obvious to us. We know that the body needs to rest in order to have energy for the upcoming race. But this idea that we assume so quickly for our body, for some reason we don't apply it to our brain, even though our brain is a muscle and a part of our body. So the brain needs sleep. And I'm saying that knowing full well that a lot of you are very busy students with a lot of responsibilities. And I understand that it's not always possible to get a beautiful long sleep every night. But I do think that we tend to put sleep at the bottom of our priority list. And I want to encourage you maybe to bump that up the priority list. And you might even find that it will save you time and energy and stress in the long run. There might be other things that are causing you to have difficulty sleeping, and that's fair, and that's your own situation. So I'm going to give you some general knowledge, and hopefully you can find something here that can work for your situation. So the brain needs to sleep. The brain, when you're learning something new and you don't get a good night's sleep, the ability to learn can drop by as much as 40%. And this is all from brain-based science that has recently come out. So we know that if we feel sleepy in the morning, we didn't get a good sleep, we might feel groggy in our brains. We probably have all experienced that. So you can just apply that obviously to your regular day. If you get up and you go to class and you didn't get a good sleep, you probably won't be able to focus very well. If you continually get bad sleeps or not enough sleep, you might see a trend in your ability to learn new information. Other reason that you need sleep for your brain is because your brain needs to take that time to work through your learning. So as you sleep, your brain is taking all of the information that you learned that day and processing it. We are constantly encountering new information. Some of it is very trivial, and some of it's very important. Most of the information that we gather during the day isn't important to remember. But some of it's very important, especially if you're a student. And so your brain needs sleeping time to take that learning and to process it and put it into your long-term memory. It's strengthening that important learning, which ultimately helps you in the days down the road when you have to recall that information, either in a test or in a class discussion or something to that effect. A good night's sleep also helps you solve problems and process emotions. So you may have had this experience where in the evening you can't remember something. You can't remember someone's name, or you can't remember where you left something important. And in the morning you wake up and suddenly you remember. That might have happened to you. That's because even though you're sleeping, your brain is still working through information that you took in that day. And so it's really incredible what our brains do without us even realizing it. They're taking the information that we learned that day, processing it, solving problems, and in the morning, our brain is stronger. Those memories that are important are stronger, and we will be able to better recall that the next day in our classes. So the point here is this: the sleep that you get after you study is just as important as the sleep you get before you study. So sometimes we think, oh, I got a good night's sleep, now I'm ready to study. And we forget that we need another good night's sleep to help our brain sort through all of that learning that we just did. So it's kind of like you have to bookend your learning with sleep. Again, I know some things are out of our control, but if we can attempt to prioritize this or work at establishing better sleep routines, you might notice that you're better able to both learn new information and then recall that information later on, for example, in a test environment. Okay, I'm going to show you two study schedules here. And the question is, which one do you think is best? And if you want to vote, you can put your vote in the chat. So in both of these situations, there is a chapter 1 to 4 test on Friday of the week. In Schedule 1, the student will study for 5 hours the day before the test. In Schedule 2, the student will study for 1 hour each day for 5 days before the test. So which study schedule do you think is best, 1 or 2? So I hope, and I see in the chat some votes, I hope that you recognize that study schedule 2 is better. And absolutely it is. And oftentimes, even though we know this is the case, we still attempt to do study schedule 1. And you might recognize that in yourself. I know I have done it before too. We call this cramming. And we call it cramming because the word cram means to take a lot of stuff and put it in a small space. So we're trying to take a lot of information and squeeze it into our brain in hopes that our short-term memory can remember it the very next day for the test. But that is not the best way to learn, and your brain will not enjoy that, and you will not remember information later down the road. So what we need to do is we need to give our brain time. And you can do that by planning in advance some smaller study sessions, not just the day before the test. The brain, when it's learning new information, it's making connections. Every time you learn something new, your brain is connecting information to something you already know, and it's creating new pathways in your brain between your neurons, your nerve cells. And every time you revisit that learning, the connection is strengthened. So if you have very weak connections in your brain, it's going to be harder to remember. If you have strong connections, it's easier to remember. And that's basically the difference between our short-term memory and our long-term memory. If we can move information into our long-term memory, we will be more likely to remember it easier. Yeah? So I'll show you here 5 images. This is kind of a metaphor for what's happening in our brain when we learn something new. So what's happening in our brain is our nerve cells are talking to each other. They're sending messages, and they do this all the time. Neurons are constantly sending messages all over your body that allows you to breathe and walk and sleep and eat. And we now know in brain science that when you learn something new, new nerve cells are being created. And these neurons are talking to each other. So if you can connect your neurons over and over and over, you're actually going to be creating a stronger connection. So here we see 5 stages of learning. So the first stage is like you're wandering between 2 spots in a forest and you can't quite find your way there. Stage 2, now we have a faint outline of a pathway. Stage 3, you're reviewing content, now you have a gravel path. Stage 4, you're reviewing again, you have a paved road, and stage 5, we've got a highway. And in stage 5, that highway, that's when that information is automatic and you don't have to work hard at recalling it. It's really easy to remember, and it's very established in your long-term memory. That's the goal when we're studying, that we want to keep reviewing over and over and over so the connections are really, really strong. So the best thing you can do is once your brain has almost forgotten something, then you go back and you recall it and you review it. It's like you're giving your brain a workout and you're strengthening your memory. So if it helps to think of your brain like you would working out any muscle in your body, right? You have to go back little by little to keep working at it to strengthen it. And this is really important to space out your studying. This is a graphic and it's called the curve of forgetting. And this visual, it shows you what happens in your brain when you learn something new. So let's say on day 1, you learn 100% of the new information. If you do not review that information again, by day 7, it will basically be gone. Okay? It's just because the brain has so much information in it. And if you don't tell it it's important and go back to it, it won't bother to remember it. But if you do a little bit of reviewing, and just a little bit, you can avoid this steep decline of memory. So in your studies, this would look like on day 1, you go to class, you learn the content in your lecture. Day 2, you get to class 10 minutes early, you review the content from yesterday. That's all that it means. And you don't have to keep the same amount of review. What you'll see is it takes actually less and less time every time you review it. You're just strengthening that connection between the neurons. Sometimes it is hard to imagine for things like knowledge that we're learning or theory that we're learning in class. But it's easy to think about this when it comes to skills. For example, you can think about the first time you learned to write your name with a pen. The very first time you wrote this, it probably didn't even look like characters, right? Maybe someone else in your life couldn't even read it. But as you kept practicing that and you took time, you took more and more time to practice it, it eventually is something you now do without even thinking about it. So you have to allow yourself time. You can't get good at something immediately, as much as we wish we could. It does take time. So the golden rule of studying is a little and often. A little and often. This does mean that you need to think in advance, be a bit proactive, but you can reduce the amount of studying you do by spacing it out. So this is a question you can feel free to just think about for yourself. When you sit down to study, how long are your typical study sessions? I'm going to show you another graphic that proves this point, that the brain needs breaks. So the human brain tends to remember the beginnings and endings of things versus something in the middle. So last night I went to a concert, and I can tell you immediately the very first song that the band played and the very last song the band played. It is in my memory very easily. If you ask me the rest of the songs, just because it happened last night, I can probably take some time and remember most of them. I probably won't remember all of them because the brain remembers beginnings and endings. So how does this impact your study sessions? Well, if you have a very long study session, let's say it's 3 hours long, and you don't take any breaks, you have one beginning and you have one ending 3 hours later, your brain will remember the information that you studied at the beginning and the ending of that study session, but there will be a big dip in what you can remember in the middle of that study session. And you can see here in the image that is represented by that curved red line, right? So how can we use this information to maximize the time that we have for studying? Because you are all very busy. So what can we do to make sure that we're studying smarter and not just harder? Well, you can add lots of beginnings and endings to your study sessions by building in short breaks. Maybe this is something you already do. Everyone's a little bit different, but this is typically helpful for anyone who is studying. So you can see in my image here, the red line is still there representing if you didn't take breaks, that dip in the memory. But by taking breaks, you're adding lots of beginnings and endings. And so the dip in what you remember is not nearly as severe, and you will be able to better recall the information. So taking breaks is really, really important. Just like working out at the gym, you can't always work the same muscle group for 3 hours straight. You need to take breaks. You need to rotate out to allow the muscle to have rest and to process what you're asking it to do. So here I've said, 30 to 45 minutes of studying with a 10 to 15-minute break. That's just one way of doing it. Maybe there's different time durations that you find work better for you, and that's fair. But building in breaks is really important. Now, what do you do for breaks? I've got a list here of examples of breaks that you might take. Which of these are good breaks? You can see I have this list: going on social media, playing video games, sending emails, paying bills, going for a walk, having a quick nap, playing with your dog, or eating an apple. Well, the list on the left are not helpful breaks. The list on the right are good breaks for your brain. The reason is that studying is a cognitive task. You are asking a lot of your brain when you're studying. It's working very hard. So you want to give your brain a true break from having to work really hard at taking in new information or thinking critically about things. So give your brain a true rest by doing any of the breaks on the right list. Now, I italicized the word quick because you can take a quick nap, but don't take a really long nap. That could get in the way of your study routine. Sometimes people feel really groggy when they wake up, but sometimes people can take quick naps, a 10 to 15-minute nap, and then they feel refreshed. If that's you, you could try it. You could also try doing a little bit of mild exercise, going for a walk or getting fresh air, playing with your dog, eating an apple, something that feels restful to you and allows your brain a chance to rest from the cognitive work you're asking it to do. Okay. Our last section here. Think of something that you know how to do really well. And how did you learn this skill? This could be something in school, or it could be something outside of school. Maybe it's something like cooking or gardening or playing a musical instrument. Think about, how did you learn that skill? It's not something probably that you are good at instantly. It probably took a lot of practice, making a lot of mistakes, and allowing yourself to learn from those mistakes. So the brain needs practice. So in this session, we've been talking about practice in the sense that the brain needs to revisit information over time. But here I'm also talking about the kind of practice that you give your brain. It's really important that you practice in the right way to maximize your learning potential. So how would you prepare for something like a big basketball game coming up, or a really important piano exam, right? If you're preparing for a basketball game, would you just sit and study game plans? Would you just sit and watch other people play basketball? If you were preparing for a piano exam, would you just sit and study sheet music or theory? No, of course not. Maybe those things complement your preparation, but the main thing that you're practicing is the actual skill that's going to be tested. So if you are preparing for a basketball game, you're actually on the court practicing basketball. You're doing drills, you're scrimmaging. If you're preparing for a piano exam, you're at the piano, moving your hands over the keys and practicing what that feels like in your body. So this is the exact same idea for your tests. If you are preparing for a test, your brain is making connections for the same thing that you're doing. So if in preparation for a test, you are just rereading your notes, that is not effective studying. Your brain is practicing the skill of reading, which is a good skill to practice, but on a test, you are not tested on your ability to read. You are being tested on your ability to retrieve knowledge from your memory and then produce it. Usually it's by speaking it out loud. Often it's writing it down. In a practical sense, it might be actually doing some sort of practical skill, but you have to produce something, right? So we know that the brain learns new information by making these connections. We talked about that earlier. So you can strengthen those connections by practicing with new information. This also is the case for if you're studying math. Some of you might be in math courses right now. If you listen and watch while math problems are being solved, which you often do with an instructor, for example, you are going to learn how to listen and watch math problems being solved. But if you actually practice solving the problems yourself, you learn how to solve problems, which is what you will be tested on when it comes time for your math exam, right? So your job is to make sure that you are studying the skill that is being tested. And that's called self-testing. So how can you self-test? There might be some strategies you've already used. That's wonderful. I'm going to share with you 3 ideas that you can use in your study sessions to practice actually being tested. The first one is called free recall. And this is very simple. You put away your class notes, you pick a topic that you've learned about, and you write or you sketch everything you can remember on that specific topic. You can do that by hand on a piece of paper, on a whiteboard, on a computer document, but you are basically just going into your memory and retrieving what you know and putting it down somewhere. So this is a very unstructured way of self-testing, but it works perfectly fine because you're practicing the skill of retrieving information and producing it. One of the most common ways of self-testing is flashcards, which you may have done. So you can create a set of flashcards, physical flashcards, or there's lots of examples online of programs you can use to create digital versions. The important part about flashcards is that you are actually producing the answer to the question. Sometimes we are tempted to just quickly go through the flashcards and say, I know that, I know that, I know that. But that's not going to work on the test. So you have to actually go into your memory and say the words out loud. Make sure you are prioritizing the cards that you struggle with. It's easy to go to those cards that we know well because we feel good about answering it, but that's not actually going to save you time. The third example I have for self-testing is practice tests. So, and you might have access to this kind of information depending on your course. A lot of textbooks have study questions or end of chapter review questions. You can use those to study. Sometimes instructors give you practice test questions. Sometimes there's information online you can find. If that is not available to you, you can always sit down and create your own practice tests. That's actually a really great way to study as well. And if you have a partner in your class, you can divide up that work. I'll prepare questions from chapter 1, you prepare questions for chapter 2, and then we'll swap and see how we did on each other's practice test. Thinking like your instructor, what would my instructor test me on, is also a great way to strategize your study sessions. So in all of these cases, what's important to remember is that you're checking your answers for accuracy because you don't want to practice incorrectly. Sometimes we say practice makes perfect, but actually practice makes permanent. So you want to make sure that the neurons are firing and making a connection in a correct way so that you're not having to unlearn something and then relearn it, which takes a lot of energy and time. And self-testing doesn't have to only happen at test time. You can build it into your regular study sessions. There's lots of examples of how you can do that. Perhaps an instructor is giving you an example in class, try another one on your own right away. Take a few minutes after every class to try to summarize the main ideas that you covered in your own words. Or after reading a paragraph, write a question, and write a question that the answer you can find in the paragraph itself that you just read. Those are all quick examples of how you can build self-testing into your study sessions. So to summarize the key points from today's session, the brain and learning, sleep is integral to learning, consolidating, and recalling information. Sleep is important before you study and after you study. Your brain needs time to make strong connections between the concepts and ideas you're learning. Don't rely on cramming just the night before. Try to build in regular, true cognitive breaks in your study sessions, and try to prepare for your tests by self-testing. So like I said, this was workshop number 1. We covered a lot of information. I will be posting this recording on the website as soon as it becomes available. You can see that we have 3 more sessions scheduled in this series. On Thursday, we have critical thinking and learning. It's the same link that you used today to access this meeting. Next week, we have stress and learning on the Tuesday and procrastination and learning on Thursday. You are more than welcome to attend any or all of the sessions that you find interesting or helpful for you. At the bottom of the slide here, we have the URL that you can use to access more information to read about these workshops. And I wanted to remind you that this is coming to you from the Academic Success Center, where we have a lot of academic supports and services available to all college students. So you're welcome to check those out as well when you have a moment. If you have any questions about today's workshop, you can email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you are more than welcome as well to check out the Academic Success Center's website.